Hong Yu Wong. Today we've got 4 more chapters we're going to work through. This session is on balance, and we've got a commentary by Jack Woods, who's a former colleague of mine from Bilkent, former colleague of Istvan as well, and he's now at Leeds. And he sort of really works on the philosophy of maths and metaethics, but balance.
Math involves balance.
A lot of balance.
Each side of the equation, yeah, perfect.
So I'm going to try to give my talk on one leg. Let's see how long it will.
Okay.
Should I use my good leg or the bad leg?
You can take it.
Okay, good. So yesterday we got through the embodied action part, and we started a bit on embodied life. We talked about ownership. And with the idea of ownership, my view developed with Christina was this two-layered view of certain self-specific experiences that involve affective, defensive, prudential, spatial aspects. And the second layer of the account of ownership was judgment of ownership, where you'd have more first-person stuff. Now, if I had got my act together before this workshop, and I would have argued that ownership is a condition on a sense of agency with my body in the core cases, which apparently Istvan disagrees with, because I think he thinks it's virtual all the way down. I think so. That disagreement will be had for another occasion. And now I'm going to talk about balance. So philosophers have not been interested in balance for whatever reason. I think there's one paper.
We're all on balance.
maybe. There's one paper by Charles Taylor in the Aristotelian Society in the 60s, which is called The Validity of Transcendental Arguments. And there he discusses an argument which he thinks is from Merleau-Ponty, and then he applies it to a case of balance. And Evans picks up on this a little bit in Varieties of Reference. And that's the extent of the philosophical discussion on balance. But in fact, I think balance is tremendously interesting sense, because in a way balance is a little bit like touch. It both concerns the inner and the outer. The vestibular sense is simultaneously giving you a sense of how you are orientated in the gravitational field and how the gravitational field is oriented. And so it's giving you this connection. And you see that kind of connection only in the case of touch as well. You're simultaneously being modified by external objects in such a way, such that there's a sensation component. And this involves also a kind of distal component. So that's interesting. And it's interesting that both balance and touch are bodily senses. So this bit, what I'm doing is expanding notions of bodily senses and the notion of bodily action, which comes with it. It turns out that once you look at balance, you get a much more holistic view of awareness, embodiment, and the kind of perception-action links. So I think if you look at embodiment, there's really a lot of action. Sorry, if you look at the vestibular sense, there's really a lot of action there. So I'm going to give you a very quick tour of the sense of balance, the functions of balance, and I'm going to put up the sketch of the beginnings of what I call a philosophical physiology of balance. Okay? Okay, so what does the vestibular system do? It answers 2 basic questions. Which way is up? Where am I heading? Okay. How does it do this? Basically, there are 2 receptor systems. There are 3 semicircular canals which have fluid in them, and they sense changes in angular acceleration. Okay. And there are 2 otolytic organs called the utricle and the saccule, And they sense changes in linear acceleration and gravity. Okay, so if you look at how it is in the inner ear, that's the ear, and they're attached to the cochlea, and the utricle and saccule are here, and the three semicircular canals are there. So that's what the structures are like. And here you have the fluid going in three planes, and you have the utricle and saccule sensing linear acceleration. Okay, it's important to note not only that you have a functional unit on each side, but that they are paired. Okay, they're paired in responses. So there's one on each side of the ear, such that this allows you to resolve basically linear acceleration and angular acceleration in any plane. Okay, based on the kind of complementary responses. So it's very, very, very nice system. It's one of the most basic sensory systems in creatures. And it's got very, very interesting properties as a sensory system. The first property is the property of constancy. Now, typically, most sensory systems adapt. So if you have a constant level of stimulation, then the neuron spike rate goes down. Okay, because basically the sensory system is for sensing change. Now the interesting thing is that the spike rate for gravity, linear acceleration, it never goes down. So this is one of the few senses where you don't get the kind of adaptation. Okay. That also means that if you go to space, you're screwed up for quite a while. Okay. The second thing is what theorists, and in particular physiologists, always talk about as the silence of the vestibular system, the silence of the vestibular system. So normally you have the phenomenology of vision, touch, all this multicolor, technicolor, smelling good, flavors, and so on and so forth. But balance, the thought is that you never ever feel in or out of balance unless you're really out of balance. So for example, when you're on the edge of a cliff, or when you're on a roller coaster, or when you're very sick, when you're motion sick. In one of these Istanbul taxis, they can drive in such an incredible way. So the thought is that this is a special sense, and it's because of its constancy that you have the silence of the vestibular sense. Okay, that's the idea. Because the simulation that it's tracking is so constant that it would be a massive load on your system if it weren't silent. That's the thought that physiologists press. But really here you want to distinguish between two things. Silence, meaning a complete lack of phenomenology, versus the lack of a proprietary phenomenology of the vestibular sense. Okay? These two things are different. And I think it's the second that's correct, even though it seems silent, it's actually because the phenomenology of balance is very, very multisensory. It's almost everywhere. It's as a Hegelian would put it, it's always already everywhere. Sorry. The third thing, which is very interesting about the sense, is that you have motion encoded in absolute way. Okay. So in all other senses, motion is encoded. We have a cat, philosophical cat, encoded relatively. So if you're sitting in a train and the train beside you moves, you feel you're moving as well. Yeah, everyone has felt that illusion. So that's called visualfaction, and that's because the way the visual system senses movement is through change. Now, in the vestibular sense, because you have receptors within the head, what they can do is that the frame of reference is in the head itself, the medium of the sensor. So what you can have is an absolute head motion. You can track absolute head motion in a head-centered frame of reference. Okay? In no other sensory modality can you do this. So that's very interesting. You have a kind of absoluteness. So that means that the head, in a way, can be used to anchor spatial location in perception and action. And the fourth thing about the sense is it seems to be inherently multimodal in some sense. at least at the level of processing and in terms of the neural substrates. So if you look at vestibular efferents, once you go past the thalamic connections, immediately within a few synapses, you are linking with visual, proprioceptive, agentive, as in motor kind of pathways immediately. So this is a highly multisensory sense. And if you look at its neural substrate, there are two things that you notice. First, there's no thalamic nucleus dedicated solely to vestibular processing. So for the other senses, typically you have a thalamic nucleus, initial relay station that collects all the inputs and then it goes to cortex. Okay, you don't have this in the vestibular case, and you don't have something like a primary vestibular cortex. Okay, the primary cortex would be an area that mainly responds to receptors from that sense, and you don't have that. Okay, instead, what you have is these areas have been identified as the human vestibular cortex, the temporal parietal junction, operculum, and the insula. And these are highly multisensory areas, okay, which are also involved in other functions. And the interesting thing for people like Bud Craig and for phenomenological psychologists is that this involves the insula, which some people think is the site of self-consciousness. I myself don't believe such claims, but oh, yeah, that'd be great.
It's fine.
Yeah, let me go on the
Trying
table.
to reach the food.
Okay.
We thought she was interested in balance.
How do you
Just
know?
showing off.
Yeah. So you can see that the sense is extremely special. And from this point of view, one thought you might have is that it has a foundational role in anchoring the agent to his location.
It's okay. I take the breakfast. It's okay.
No, it's fine, it's fine, it's fine,
I think
it's
it's
fine.
harder to fight with him.
It's fine.
Ken is like Alf.
It's
You know
fine.
Alf? Remember Alf?
Okay.
Alf, the sitcom?
So this is roughly
Always grabs
the what's unusual about the vestibular sense, and other than the basic functions of tracking gravity and angular acceleration, very little has been said about the function of the vestibular sense. So one way to go about it is to look at cases of pathologies. So we can look at pathologies of balance. Okay. So very typical conditions of pathologies of balance are the following. Positional vertigo or labyrinthitis, Meniere's disease, or vestibular deafferentation. You don't need to think about these diseases in particular. I'm more interested in the symptoms you find in cases of vertigo and their connection with the sensory system. So typical symptoms include dizziness, vertigo, disorientation, imbalance, feeling out of balance, blurry or double vision, very interesting, resulting in a loss of balance and postural control, nausea, vomiting, and falls. Okay. So here's an account of vestibular deafferentation when someone loses their entire peripheral vestibular system. So this was a U.S. Army doctor, and he had a kind of infection, I think, from shrapnel wound, and he took a certain kind of antibiotic, which we now know is highly toxic for the vestibular system. So after a matter of weeks, one day when he got up, he felt unstable. When he went to wash in the bathroom, he thought that someone had pushed him from behind. We looked behind, no one was there. Okay? And soon he realized that something was very wrong. So initially he had problems standing with his eyes closed, soon he had vertigo, and this is a quote from his paper. Every movement in bed gave rise to vertigo and nausea, even when I kept my eyes open. If I shut my eyes, the symptoms were intensified. Okay? And besides vertigo, which you would expect because you feel in balance or feeling out of balance, when you lose your vestibular system, you feel out of balance, okay? But also he suffered from problems with vision. So his vision was blurry and he suffered from what's called oscillopsia, okay? So oscillopsia is, so when you go on a roller coaster and things are really fast, then the world appears to be this visual blur. Yeah. So in some of these cases, what people see is they see double images of things, or things seem to be a blur, and so on and so forth. Yeah. And the reason for that is because the vestibular system is immediately connected with reflexes for gaze stabilization. Okay? It's extremely important for gaze control. Okay? Wow. Well, at least you got something.
Imagine you crash. Putting it in bed.
My slide.
It's a consolation prize.
Yeah.
Now, so this is because I was just about to say the cat couldn't compensate for. This is because
Read that to my home. I can't play it.
Why do we need? You could. Okay, I thought Christina was going to have it.
that's the other option.
Yeah.
This,
Coming up to the shield.
this is because what the vestibular system does is stabilize the gaze and gives information to the eyes about how the head is moving. So if you've seen, so if everyone should now fixate on Jack, handsome Jack, please. And now, whilst fixating on Jack, keep looking at him, please. Just look really hard at him, keep your gaze there, and now turn your head 15 degrees to the right while still keeping your gaze. Yeah? Okay, so Jack didn't move, right, in that transaction? Well, that's because the vestibular system was telling your eyes about the position of movement of your head, and then your eyeballs were calibrated accordingly. Okay, that's lost when you have the vestibular deafferentation. Okay, and he also couldn't walk for a period. Why? Because you also have the vestibular system calibrating reflexes for postural stabilization. So immediately you lose two sets of the most basic reflexes for gaze stabilization, so that you can see what you need to act on, and postural stabilization, so that you can stay up and move. And so it's extremely important. Now, I'm now going to do an experiment. I don't have ethics approval, but we're in Istanbul. So, so I'm going to simulate an experience of vertigo. Okay, this is going to be what vertigo is like. Okay, so could you please look here? There's a fixation cross in the center.
Does anyone have epilepsy?
Yeah, if anyone has epilepsy, they can look. Okay.
I don't know if I have.
No, you will.
We'll figure it out.
Isn't this from a Hitchcock film?
Yeah.
Where to go?
So, this apparently feels the sensations of whirling and spinning of the world around you. Apparently, this is what vertigo feels like. Okay, a couple people who suffered from vestibular disease, like Casey O'Callaghan, have confirmed that this is pretty accurate. So good. So I'm very interested in vertigo because I think vertigo tells us something about the structure of the connection between perception and action. Okay. In the acute phase of this kind of vestibular disease, patients often experience dizziness and bouts of vertigo, and you get these sensations of whirling and imbalance, and they're exacerbated if you're moving. Okay. And what patients quickly learn is they learn to stay motionless during vertigo attacks. Okay. What's interesting is that this shows that the vestibular system seems to be providing a sense of which way is up and a sense of self-motion. Confusion about self-motion and orientation result in vertigo and difficulties in moving, which paralyze the agent. Okay? So what's happening here, what you see in these cases, is that the core behavioral repertoire of the agent is disabled because the vestibular system is disabled. Of course, the agent can do things like move the fingers and stuff like that, you know, but the agent can't really even crawl. Okay, so the core behavioral repertoire, in some sense, core behavioral capacities are now. In some sense, I think this takes away what the phrase that some people didn't like yesterday, immediate implications for action. Okay, given this spiel, we have a sense of these as the basic functions for balance. So balance is important for staying balanced, it's important for tracking gravity, orientation, self-motion, the reflexes for gaze stability, I've already talked about, reflexes for postural stability, and other things are providing a sense of the subjective vertical, and also providing an absolute frame of reference that's head-centered. Okay? So I won't talk about these specifics, but we have a cat here. One thing that's really important that has been emphasized in the French physiology of balance is this absolute head-centered aspect. And the French tradition of systems neuroscience, which is exemplified in Paillard and in Alain Berthol's, both of them are extremely phenomenological thinkers as well, very philosophical. They have emphasized that gravity provides this absolute head-centered frame of reference, which is also geotropic. Okay, it's centered relative to the plane you're on. So they have looked at a range of different animals, and basically you find that you have the spinal cord and the vestibular system above it, roughly near the objective vertical for most land animals. So you see here the rat, the rabbit, the guinea pig, the cat, and here you see different spinal columns. Now, the implication of having an absolute head-centered geotropic frame of reference of this sort is that it provides a plane in the Gibsonian sense. So what you have immediately is this idea of what's up and this field in front of you. Now once you have this plane, then you have what's roughly an action space. Okay, so in a way the thought here is that this is the basic anchor for your action space, and it is the master frame of reference that coordinates all the different frames of reference that are coming from your hand, your foot, your trunk, and so on and so forth. Okay? So the thought is that this geotropic frame of reference brings together all these little frames of reference. Okay, so this is very interesting. Now, what does this do for us philosophically? Okay, so up to this point, we've mainly been concerned with special features of the sense, and maybe as a philosopher you might say, well, that's so cool, but you know, that's the stuff that people do at senses with Barry Smith. They talk about cool senses and so on and so forth. But what's the philosophical import? What's the heavyweight philosophical thing? Yeah, what's this? And I think there's very much here, and I only started thinking about this because of an act of violence on the part of my friend, Frederic de Vinemont. She forced me to write this book. Okay? But luckily, I did it, so now I have this account. Now, I think there are three major aspects in the philosophical physiology of balance. I think it plays a role in fixing the reference of here, so that we have a plane for action. It plays a role in constituting the sense of body or self or ownership, and it plays a role in giving one a sense of the world. The third we have no mechanism for as yet. And I'm going to argue in my Heideggerian synthesis that these three things come together so that we have what's called, in a hyphenated Heideggerian phrase, being in my body in the world. Okay, so balance is being in my body in the world. Yeah, Frederick also said after reading this paper that I probably spent too long in Germany. So here, usually when you think about indexicals, like here, people contrast functional versus referential understanding. So the referential understanding is given by the token
reflexive.
Yeah, token reflexive rule. Thanks. A token reflexive rule. Whereas the functional understanding is what Evans emphasized, that you have some kind of understanding of what the term is doing in the control of perception and action. Okay. So we can ask, well, typically when you have the token reflexive rule, it doesn't sort of whittle down the exact location. So if we were here in the summer, there would be air conditioning, and it might be very, very cold. So it might be 18 degrees in here, whereas out there it's 40 degrees. And you say it's cold here, it's going to be false for Istanbul, but true for this room. So how do you get that kind of context so that you get the correct reference? Now, one way to think about it is that the functional understanding can be helping to give the pragmatics for the referential understanding so that you can fix the appropriate kind of reference. Okay, and the thought here is to draw on Evans, this idea of here as where perception and action is controlled from. Okay, so it's this idea is not simply that of here as being picked out simply by the token reflexive rule. It's being picked out by its functional role in your behavior. So that's very interesting. Now, one way to extend that with the vestibular system is that what you might use in order to augment this functional understanding of here is some combination of the vestibular system, providing this geotropic frame of reference, plus the kind of touch that is involved in your feet touching the ground, for example. So this won't be true for the creatures which are flying. I think Emre would have asked this question about birds and so on. So
Do they have a vestibular system?
yes, they have a vestibular system as well.
How far down does it go down, like the...
Vestibular system?
Yeah.
It's one of the earliest sensory systems. So you get it in fish and so on.
And below fish?
Below, I don't know.
Is there any self-mover who doesn't have a vestibular system? Is the question. Is there any self-mover
Worms.
who doesn't have a vestibular system?
I think some worms have a system. So I have to check the
So they do it by
textbook.
touch?
Hmm?
So they then use touch, like the
vestibular system, the
instead
worms.
of that? I mean, they must have some.
Well, usually the vestibular system is for navigating within a kind of environment. So, for example, the fish use it in order to know which way is up and which way is down. So they have the gravitational source, and the other source is light. So if you switch the light, and then they might do this when they swim.
Is it recognisably similar to human?
The fish vestibular system.
Yeah.
It's an antecedent of the human.
Right.
So you have certain fish organs which later develop into the inner ear.
Yeah.
So for us, it's very important to have the tactile receptors on your soles, the pressure receptors, and that's also grounding a sense of your bodily presence here. Plus, what Evans emphasized in terms of the perception action. So it's not just that you're here in this very, very stationary location, but you can see the sphere of possible activities as what counts as here. Okay. And obviously, you're going to see that this is going to interact with various navigational and cognitive map type things. Okay. So in one way, you can see the vestibular system as being really important for the kind of neo-Kantian project that as Lucas put it last night, is very important in Oxford Common Rooms. Okay, in particular, I think I want to ask a question about what I call the master frame of reference just now. So, question, how does a location from where the subject controls his perception and action enter into the picture? And the thought here is that the vestibular system can be seen as anchoring the subject to his location. And as I've talked about just now, Bertels and Piaf suggested that this absolute head-centered frame of reference is the frame of reference that dominates the hierarchy of frames of reference. And therefore, linking these frames of reference using control, perception, and action. And the thought then is that this kind of thing can help us explain the behavioral significance of these cases. Fire here versus there, shark here versus there, and these are things that have immediate implications for action. And the suggestion then is that in setting up a master frame of reference, the vestibular system is simultaneously anchoring self-location and also providing for a conditional possibility for sensory motor action. So I'm both here, and this is the sphere of my activity. Okay. How do we see this? Let's go back and look at vertigo. So remember, in vertigo, the agent is incapacitated. All the agent can do is keep still, and core behavioral capacities are disabled. Immediate possibilities for action appear to be abolished. Okay? So this seems to indicate that the vestibular system is doing something really important in providing kind of necessary foundations for implications for action. Okay. This is Taylor on this. This is his Aristotelian Society paper I talked about just now. It's a very beautiful passage. In those rare moments where we lose orientation, we don't know where we are. And we don't know where or what things are either. We lose the thread of the world, and our perceptual field is no longer our access to the world, but rather the confused debris into which our normal grasp on things crumbles. QED. So that's the first point. Second point, I think the vestibular system plays a role in constructing the sense of body self-ownership. The first indications of this were from various modulations of neglect and somatoparaphrenia done in Milan in the 80s. So the Italian neuropsychological mafia has had a complete monopoly on all these cases because they have the best patients and they make the best modulations. Okay, so do people know what neglect is? Inattentional neglect. So you don't attend to certain things in some parts of your visual field. That's neglect. And somatoparaphrenia is that some limb of yours feels to be alien. So what they do is that they have this procedure for vestibular stimulation, which is called caloric stimulation. It won a Hungarian physiologist, whose name I don't remember now, a Nobel Prize 100 years ago. And it's a very simple procedure. You just put warm or cold water so that you introduce some kind of convection in the semicircular canals. Now what happens is that this biases the frame of reference in a certain way. And what you find is that this shifts the frame of reference for neglect so that they're able to report more things. And this also sometimes gives you a kind of remission from somatoparaphrenia's symptoms for a short while. Okay, so this is the neuropsychological stuff. And there also seems to be direct modulations on body shape, body perception, the sense of self-ownership or first-person perspective by vestibular stimulation. So there are a range of experiments which have been done where, on body shape, if people know the Longo kind of paradigm for establishing the shape of a hand, if you get people to do the proprioceptive localization tasks with not caloric stimulation but galvanic, which is giving you basically a current behind the ear, you report a different hand shape. Okay, so it can modulate hand shape even, which is something very basic. And you have also a modulation on experience ownership in rubber hand experiments. So you have a stronger feeling of ownership under vestibular stimulation for rubber hand experiments. And also you can modulate the extent to which people take the first person perspective in perspective taking experiments by using galvanic stimulation. So that's very interesting. All these are so far modulatory. It's not constitutive. There's not been a mechanism shown yet, but we have a modulatory effect. Interestingly, you can also have what's called the inversion illusion, where you see that in zero gravity, you have you experience illusions of changes of body shape. So this seems to be a very, very, very striking modulation on the sense of your own body. Okay, so this is from space researcher James Lackner, who also discovered some of the vibrotactile illusions that we were talking about yesterday that Marcel then used for his experiments. So in space, in zero gravity conditions, what happens is, this is one of the most common illusions. If you're blindfolded and you're sitting there, you feel that your body is telescoping, and then at some point you feel inverted, and then you telescope up again. Striking. So you have a modulation of your body shape based on a difference in gravitational conditions. Okay. It's really striking.
If we keep the situation, it keeps going like this. This is supposed to happen over and over again.
So usually they do this in microgravity conditions. So the microgravity flights, you only have the microgravity. Do people know what are microgravity flights? So you can pay to do this now. It's a couple $1,000s. You go to Houston and then you fly up, and then they switch up the engines. You free fall for a while, and then you're floating around. And then this is when you can experience things like that. You basically have 7 or 8 of these drops, which are not too long, a couple of minutes. So in the space station, they report that they have this for a long period. So it doesn't continuously happen. So it happens
just once.
No, it happens cycles, and then it stops. And people haven't studied how the periodicity of the illusion relates with stuff. Yeah, proceed.
It isn't the case that in the normal case we have two origins. One is egocentric and the other is the center of the gravitational field. And because here we only have the egocentric origin but haven't the center of the gravitational field, is kind of try to find where to put the center of the gravitational field, and that is why.
That would be one explanation, but there could be other possible explanations too. Because one interesting thing is, if you are Bayesian, why is the best thing to adjust in this case your body shape?
Because
right?
I think that
because gravity is such a constant that it can't be gravity that it's changing. It's your body. That's really weird. That's really weird.
Yeah, but I think it's the up-down. Like,
no, but I think there are multiple
he cannot settle
explanations.
the up-down. It has to be settled, and he try out the two options. And
Yeah, but you could have it through a spontaneous flip. It wouldn't have to telescope. So I think there are multiple explanations. So this is quite striking. But what you also find is that there's a range of neurological cases, they're called in the literature autoscopic illusions. Okay, there are very, very few of these cases. Actually, Merleau-Ponty discussed a few of them already. It's very hard to draw statistical conclusions because you have so few of these patients. So the interesting cases for us are, so in out-of-body experience, what happens is you have patients lying down, and then they feel that their experienced body is floating up and looking down back at them. Yeah, okay. And in this case, they have both issues with ownership of their body, typically, and also issues with the kind of full body experience. And in this case, what's called hotoscopy, when a patient is standing, they can experience a hallucination of looking at themselves, and their self-location and first personal perspective from where they're looking can switch between the two cases, and also the sense of ownership can switch between the two cases, and they report also that in some cases they can feel bilocated. Okay, it's very weird. So you have a breakdown of self-location, first-person perspective, and ownership in these cases. Now, contrast this with the case of autoscopic hallucination, where you have a similar thing, except you have a body double, but you don't have a breakdown of the first-person perspective, and you don't have a breakdown of ownership, but you have this body double on this side. Now, these two cases are the interesting cases that we need to consider, autoscopy and autoscopic hallucination. Because in both cases, you have the hallucinated body double, but only in the right-hand side case do you have problems with embodiment and ownership. Now, what's the main difference between these two cases? Vestibular damage. So this indicates that the vestibular thing can be doing something in setting the mechanisms for sort of self-locating in the correct place. Okay. Now, finally, as promised, we're going to get to the sense of the world. Okay, we talked about the sense of the body, the self. Here, the sense of here, and now it's the sense of the world. So there are two senses of the sense of the world that the vestibular system is involved in. The first one is a spatial sense. So as we saw just now, you get spatial disorientation with the inversion illusion. Another kind of illusion that you get is called the room tilt illusion. So the inversion illusion and the room tilt illusion are the two most important microgravity illusions. So what happens often is that in microgravity flights or in space, they suddenly feel that the room has tilted around them. Entire scene has tilted around them. Okay? Imagine you feel this now. Okay? Now it's very striking. Okay? Your whole comportment to the world has changed. Okay? So, and you also get that same sense of disorientation, this relation to the world, breaking down in the case of vertigo, as we saw just now. Now, the other case that's interesting is a non-spatial sense toward the world, rather an affective comportment toward the world. And we find this in depersonalization and derealization disorders. So this is kind of a disease that's now become very interesting to philosophers and psychologists. There's not a very strong sense of what its organic cause is or how it should be characterized exactly. But here's the standard inventory for assessing this, and I want you to look at 4 items. First, surroundings seem strange and unreal. Second, there's a feeling of detachment or separation from surroundings. Third, they feel as if they are walking on shifting ground. And fourth and fifth, they feel isolated from the world. And finally, they feel spacey or spaced out. So there's a kind of affective disconnection with the world. They feel as if it's unreal. Okay? And what we find is that if you take normal people and you give them vestibular stimulation, they experience this kind of symptoms. Okay? And the profile to which they experience that is very similar to what you find in derealization and depersonalization patients. And you also find a higher incidence of vestibular disorders in derealization and depersonalization patients. So there seems to be a connection here. Okay? Yes.
These disorders, is there sort of a periodic experience of these things for them? Or
Yes,
do they, over
periodic.
time, actually go away, in a sense?
Do they go away? I haven't read enough cases in order to answer that.
Okay.
I think it's very variable. It also comes with depression, so it's very complex.
Mixed with those.
Yeah. And,
It depends on the main. It depends on the main deficiency. So, as long as anxiety, depression, usually those they try to treat them, and then these symptoms would go away because of treatments.
I think it's not like somatoparaphrenia, which can be just very short and go away and short come back. So I think it's not like that.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Ishvan works on these cases.
Well, I'm reading and not working on
Yeah.
anything.
But my sense is that the clinical scenario is extremely heterogeneous.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
There's some people who have it for certain periods, and then in a lot of the patients it's mixed with other kinds of things. Some have depersonalization syndromes and cotards and so on and so on.
Okay.
Yeah. Now I'm going to skip these challenges and sort of sum up. Okay. So what I've argued is that there's a sense of the constitution of here that's provided by balance. So being here is provided by balance. There's a sense of the body, the self, and body ownership that's provided by balance, and therefore we have a sense of hyphenated being in my body. And thirdly, we have this connection with the world that the vestibular system seems to be involved in. So it's a sense of being in the world. You can see how these three roles of balance can be naturally brought together to reflect the vestibular system in a way as balancing the self, the body, and the world. So the upshot is that the vestibular system can be seen as anchoring the self to the body in the world, and therefore we have this Heideggerian picture of balance as being in my body in the world. Thank you.
He's now going to give a commentary. He's going to try and out Heidegger. No. Do you want to, is it filming?
Oh, I can move over a little bit. Yeah.
We're filming this, so don't say anything bad about Erdogan in the question.
So no, so indeed no. So thanks very much for this. It was very stimulating to read it. Thanks also for the first time in my philosophical career I've had an entire room give me the side eye. It was lovely. So as you might suspect, given my background, I'm going to focus on some stuff that happened at the very end. And it's going to be more along the lines of raising, I think, interesting questions, or what I think of as interesting questions, than finding about the particulars of the account. I found the chapter very, very persuasive. One thing I thought was especially good was the opening argument, which came up a little bit here, but is stressed more in the chapter, arguing that that there is a distinctive phenomenology of balance. It's just, as Hong really nicely puts it, it's not silent, it's quiet. And that strikes me as exactly right. One thing that I thought was very interesting at the very end of the text was, of course, I do semantics, right? So what do I care about? Well, so here's a really nice point that's being made. You can separate out, as I think you should, the token reflexive semantic account of the meaning of a term like here, from what you might think of as the metasemantic account of the sort of Evans type analysis, which plays a role in fixing the token reflexive analysis. I think you're absolutely right, these are consistent. In fact, they're completely separate questions. The first question is, what does it mean? The second question is, how does it mean what it means? And I think that the point is, the vestibular system plays a role in nailing down how here gets the meaning that it does, right? It's because of our particular sense of where here is that the token reflexive actually picks up this place instead of some other. That strikes me as exactly right. I would at some point like to hear a little bit more about how that fixing happens, because you might think that there are cases where the semantic role is unchanged, but something has gone awry in the metasemantics, right? So, for example, attributions of here claims to other people where you don't know where that person is, right? Something like second personal, Ken believes that he's here, but he's not. And other cases where you have cross-wire type cases where something has gone wrong with my vestibular system. And so my center will be off. Nevertheless, it doesn't seem to be clear that the here functions different semantically. So I totally agree that it's going to play an important role. I don't think it's going to be the sole determinant in the relevant sense, right? Okay. Now to something a little more inchoate, but I think interesting. So I used to suffer from periodic bouts of vertigo, to the point where I had to take medicine to sort of to sort of numb the little micro hairs in my ear so I could sort of get up. And one thing that I thought was interesting is the connection between being and your body, because the phenomenology for me about that was always about an incredibly embodied feeling. In some sense, it really emphasized how local I was, right? Now, I completely agree that it would be unworldly, right? In fact, the world seemed like very out of control, and the idea that somehow my agency was severely limited with that system is very plausible. But in some sense, I don't think I've ever felt as sort of like thrown into my own body as I have when I was suffering from vertigo. So I wonder whether whether the connections between things like differentiation of the vestibular system and the sort of resulting effects are going to be nice and stable, right? It looks to me like you're going to get a bunch of different phenomenologies depending on other things that are going on.
Do you think you're throwing it into your own body because you're reducing the world?
Yeah, that's what I was thinking. It's like I feel like I have less sort of connection out there, and so I'm really tapped into what's going on here. In particular, the fact that like everything's like that. And of course, it might be that the phenomenology of vertigo is different for different people. That's how it struck me at the time. Now, if that's right, I wonder. So one thing I found really convincing at the end, I want to hear more about the details, but was this idea that what's really going on with the vestibular system is it's playing this master framing role for other sensory modalities like proprioception and touch, right? If that's right, it seems like in cases like vertigo, and depending on how, you know, the particular system's physiology, that it might be that these things are playing an immediate compensatory role, right? But I was a little, I was left with, at the end of the chapter, with a question about how it is that you would get an independent sense of reference, right? When, for example, you had something like bilateral differentiation of the vestibular system, right? Would it be one of these cases where the mind would be plastic enough to cook up another way of sort of framing our experience in the world? Or would it be the case that something like proprioceptive sense rose to the occasion and started playing the role that the vestibular system had prior played, right? So I wasn't clear which of these two was really going on there. And that raises, I think, a separate question. So I completely agree that at least in the typical well-functioning human being, the vestibular system plays an incredible role in sort of guiding our action around the world. And when you have locally impact on the vestibular system, right, it seems very plausible that your immediate conditions for agency are going to be affected quite deeply. However, as Hong points out, when you have people who have bilateral differentiated the vestibular system, they do manage to get around the world nearly as effectively as they would otherwise, right? So that suggests in some sense that what's going on with the possibilities for agency in the vestibular system is that you need some method, right, of tracking action around in the world, and when that's impacted, right, you sort of lose your sense of agency. The vestibular system there is it isn't special in the sense of like always going to be playing this role. It's rather special in that it typically for us plays this role. And when it's effective, we lose our, at least at that time, way of acting in the world, right? But nevertheless, we can pick it back up. So again, nothing super deep there, just a number of questions that were raised from me reading the chapter. I found this really interesting and persuasive. Yeah, so I'd like to hear a little bit more of that. Thank you very much.
Excellent questions.
Yeah.
You should also do some philosophy of mind, not only logic.
No.
So let's take this last thing on vestibular application. So I argue that in the normal case, the vestibular system is playing such a critical role for the master frame of reference and so on. So if that's the case, then if you have complete peripheral vestibular deafferentation, it should be terrible. You shouldn't be able to act, you should be in a wheelchair, blah, blah, blah. But that's not the case. So isn't that a straightforward counterexample? Yeah, good. So what we find, so the account that I was quoting from earlier is this U.S. Army doctor, Crawford. What happened was that after about a month or so, he was able to get back slowly to normal life. Okay, so and we find generally that peripherally deafferented subjects do pretty well in normal life. So how should I respond? So my response is that what happens when there's no intact vestibular system is that the master vestibular system of frame of reference is missing, but other frames of reference can take over. So the ramifications of this for the general account of the connection between perception and action is this. So the kind of account that I'm committed to in order to understand, say, immediate implications for action, or what you might call the psychology behind the discussions of essential lexicality, is that there's got to be a master frame of reference integrating different frames of reference. Now, as it happens, in the healthy, normal human case, the vestibular system plays that role. But in acute disease, it's terrible because that system of reference is still there, but it's compromised. So then you get lots of confusion, and you fail to have the integration that allows things to work. But when it's completely gone, it's just not there. And the next frame of reference in the hierarchy then takes over. it's an empirical question which frames of reference these are. So typically it's understood to be a visual frame of reference once they compensate, visual tactile of some sort.
Sorry, that's the take over. What does it mean? Does it mean that the other system turns into vestibular system?
No, sorry.
It's not playing the functional role.
It plays the functional role of the master frame of reference. Now.
Can I just ask a follow-up to this? Yeah, I'm the chair. Okay. So I was wondering, you said the difference, maybe this is the same question, I'm not sure, between saying that the vestibular system plays the role of the master frame of reference, or you might think there's a multimodal master frame of reference that's always there, but in normal healthy functioning, the vestibular system is giving most of the input. Yeah, so I'm just wondering, are they different claims? Or is I think they are a bit different. And I'm wondering why you would be committed to one, right? Because you might think the evidence, and I'm just wondering how you'll separate out the evidence for this, because you might think, well, you've got a single master frame of reference that's mostly modal, but in the normal functioning case, the modality that's getting most of the, giving most of the content is the vestibular system. So why not say that? Why?
Yeah, there are potentially a number of different models here. So one model is you have a completely amodal integration system where you basically build a model of the environment and you put things into it. And that amodal frame of reference is a master frame of reference. And as it happens, the vestibular system is somehow dominant in the hierarchy of things which gets put
Yeah, that was the option I was suggesting as an alternative. And I'm wondering why, to what degree is that really different? And why go for your one rather than, is there a reason?
Yeah, I'm not actually committed to that in the end, I think. Okay. Or at least I shouldn't be. So let's just draw the models. So there are a couple of claims here. So first claim, there's a master frame of reference. Okay, and another claim would be, this one claim, another claim would be that the vestibular system is giving the master frame of reference. That's one. A different claim would be that the vestibular system is somehow central in the construction of one. But is somehow not the only source. I'm fine with that. You're the chair.
Okay. So let's open. We'll open it up for general questions.
It's about this.
Okay. So we've got a follow up on this. Is this a follow up or a new question? Okay. So why don't we? Let's do a couple of follow ups. You want a follow up?
Yeah.
Okay.
So it's a comment about this general criticism about finally what you said about the relationship between master framework and Jack brought about. Actually, it has exactly, I think, the same structure, what we said about body schema, because you start with, again, and you can write just like master framework, body schema on top, and define body schema functionally, just like you can define master framework functionally, right? It gives me self-location, blah, 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 and it gives me just, the sense of the body that I need for action. So I need both master framework and the body schema. Now that vestibular system here seems to play some role. And in that part we talk about proprioception playing this kind of role. And then again, this question mark, is proprioception is one among many, the multimodal stuff that goes into the body schema. The same way here is just like, oh, is the vestibular system is one among many about this,
or is it the
multi-modal master frame, or you might say it's central, it's essential. So all we seem to have is that, as just Jack puts for the master framework yesterday, I talked about like in normal cases it seems to play a central role, but that is it necessary role? Is it just, you see, it has exactly the same structure. I want just to say that. So probably wherever you put the vestibular framework with relation to master framework here, probably you want to put the proprioception for the body schema in a similar place, because it seems to be the way you argue.
No, I think the two cases are not analogous because of what happens in cases of peripheral proprioceptive deafferentation as opposed to what happens in peripheral vestibular deafferentation. Because you get off quite well with peripheral vestibular deafferentation, but you get off terribly with peripheral proprioceptive deafferentation. So I think there's a structural similarity in the overall functional role type thing.
But the idea is that the differentiated cases gives more centrality to proprioception, whereas it doesn't give the same kind of data for the vestibular.
Yes,
Yeah.
exactly.
Okay, thank you. It's helpful.
Okay, so we've got Villa, Christina, and then we've got another hand over here.
Can I, after that, answer Jack's other questions?
Yeah, so you need a little bit more to say.
But we've got things on this question, yeah?
Yeah, just to
Okay.
basically rephrase that, which was what I was going after, is that if it's the case that you can take the vestibular system away and still do quite fine with it, what's so central about it? Why couldn't you have a non-vestibular system animal in the first place, which somehow comes up with the vestibular system?
So here's the response. I mean,
So why
Istanbul's metro is central to the transportation system. I can whack it out and just have taxis, and you can compensate and so on and so forth. But that doesn't show that the Istanbul metro wasn't central to the transportation as it was working.
Okay, but it's like genetic priority then, or something.
It's not genetic priority. It's an explanatory priority in how you're explaining its proper functioning. It's not necessary claim. This goes back to how what we were talking about after dinner yesterday.
Yeah, about the necessary
So,
connections.
yeah, I think I'll say something about it before the next session. But the way I'm conducting this project is a little bit unusual. So it's an Aristotelian project where I'm trying to, now some people are rolling their eyes. This guy's doing all this neuroscience stuff, and he says it's Aristotelian project. Yeah.
I thought it was Heideggerian.
Well, Heidegger thought he was pre-Socratic. That's true. So that's not. Yeah. Okay. Let's be serious. Okay. It's an Aristotelian project in that I'm trying to articulate the connections in the paradigm case, and then there are various departures from the paradigm case, and therefore the conditions I give are not really necessary conditions in the classical sense. Okay, that means the logic of the argument is a little bit different, and I should make that much clearer. But I think we should keep that separately for discussion so that I can get as much flack as possible.
So AJ had a finger.
No, I'm not sure about my
Please.
question, but I will ask. You said that this balance, the sense of balance, is silent or quiet, other than pathology.
Yep.
But how about the cases when we try to increase our sense of balance, or when we try to increase our postural stabilization, like the case of fire?
Yeah, good. So, so I didn't say that it's silent. So the vestibular physiologist claimed that it's silent. It's certainly quieter than the other senses. So vision is like screaming at you. Actually, vision's not the worst. I think the worst is smell. Smell is screaming at you. So when you don't like a smell, it's screaming. Get out of here! You don't like it, and so on and so forth. But the vestibular sense is relatively quiet, except when it's unbearably uncomfortable. Then it's screaming like mad. And then when it's screaming like mad, you really want it to stop. So you're exactly right, I agree. So there's lots of cases, and as Jack was indicating, my account is that there's a lack of a proprietary vestibular phenomenology, because the phenomenology of balance, so here's one way to demonstrate that. Now, if I were to be hung upside down here in the room, just as a philosophical experiment, I would feel upside down. Yeah? And that feeling of being upside down wouldn't be tremendously different if I close my eyes, or if I open my eyes. Yeah? So that feeling of balance seems to be inherently in the phenomenology already, multisensory.
But it can, I mean, if you stand on one leg and shut your eyes, that makes a big difference.
It makes a big difference functionally, but it might not make a big difference phenomenologically.
definitely does different terminology.
Well, it depends, okay. Yeah, but there are cases and cases. So overall, I think that...
Immediately it's different. So when you close your eyes, it's immediately very different.
Well, in that there's no vision, but I think...
Because vision is, as you also pointed out, helping actually to the vestibular system. They are not working separately. So when you want to rely on just one, actually all of a sudden the vestibular system.
But in this
become
case, I
very
was
good.
being hung upside down.
Oh, okay.
So
There's a chair.
we had fingers by Christina and then Ken, and then we got a hand by.
Well, but actually,
question.
Hong also wanted to
I
answer.
want to answer Jack's question. You're the chair.
Okay.
Jack, would it be possible to work on this issue on the cases when we are focusing on our balance, a sense of balance? Like, because when you are trying to walk on a straight line, you are, I don't know, you are feeling that sense of balance and you have a reference, visual reference.
Yeah, definitely. So in those cases, definitely there's a clear phenomenology of balance. So I think the vestibular physiologists are just wrong. So there's a phenomenology of balance in the cases where you have illness. There's a phenomenology of balance in any case where it's an uncomfortable situation, where you're learning how to balance, where it's vestibularly unusual. So there are lots of scenarios. And on the basis of the observations there, you see that the vestibular system is not silent. It's screaming when it's not happy. Second, there is an ordinary phenomenology of balance, like walking around and so on and so forth. It's just not very striking.
Unless you fall down.
Yes.
Yeah. Christina and then Ken and then a hand.
So,
Oh, no, and then the answer to Jack.
So there is a very easy answer why the vestibular system is kind of the default master frame of reference, because we have the proprioception, or all the other is either internal or external. So the proprioception just gives you an understanding of who your body posture is, but not relative to the world, because relative to the world you can be in any posture, and only the balance will give you something relative to the world, because it has two centers, the gravitational field, the center of the gravitational field, and in the head, in between the two organs, which is working parallelly. So then, because there are two, then you get something relative to the world, because the other is just body relative, and that can be in any way, and that is why it's the best.
That's more your account than mine.
Yeah.
But
I didn't say it's yours.
because Christina is all into the self-world differentiation kind of business. One thing I should say in response to the flag here I'm receiving is that there is evidence that the vestibular system is at the top of the hierarchy. So the evidence is this: whenever you adapt vestibular frames of reference, all other frames of reference adapt. So that gives evidence that it's at the top of the hierarchy. So in that sense, it has some kind of centrality. But if you knock it out, then you can't adapt it anymore.
How do you mean that? Can you give an example?
So for example, if I do an experiment with you, like one example of an adaptation experiment is a prism experiment. So I change your vision so that you...
Okay, so you turn
So
the other
I can do
arm
something with your
and few
head.
hours
So for example, if I pass cold or hot water in your ears, then that will give you a twisted frame of reference, and that will cause all the other frames of reference to be affected, which are under in the hierarchy.
It's just if you turn the world around and you adapt to it, but apparently you never adapt completely, although that for a long time used to be the case. I mean, that might just be that might be an indication that there is a deep connection between the vision and the vestibular system.
Oh, there is.
Or it might just be
the
fact that you were so used to the way the things were.
Well, I think there is a very, very deep connection between vision and the vestibular system, because you immediately, you could say the first basis of vision is the vestibular ocular reflex. If you don't have the vestibular ocular reflex, you're in a lot of trouble. So this is the one for gaze stabilization. I mean, so in peripherally deafferented people, what they have to do is they have to stay very still and look at stuff. Okay, so they can still see. But this is really, really important for mobile agents. In mobile agents, this is what happens. So if you're peripherally deafferent for the vestibular system, what happens is when you walk, everything's like a blur. And then you have to stop. Look, so this guy Crawford says he can't recognize people in the street. So if people say hello, he has to stop and look at them for a while before he can actually see their faces.
Okay, we had a finger by Ken. Thank you.
I want to suggest a cautionary note about the phenomenology of these kind of phenomena,
Yes.
orientation and balance, and whether you're looking or not. And it goes back to the point that Jack also emphasized, that is that these balance systems often are quiet but not silent. And part of what needs to be done are the comparisons with people like tumblers, jugglers, and figure skaters, right? You're figure skating, you spend a lot of time going backwards, right? You do not see where you're going, but you learn to know really well where you're going and how you're going to make that next jump. And one can, with moderate figure skating skills, close the eyes, know exactly where you are on the ice, and when you can make the jump because you've got the extra length of the rink, and when not because you'll go over the boards. So we got to be really careful about the phenomenology because it will vary depending on athletic training.
Completely agree.
So you can answer Jack now.
Yes, excellent. Good. So we covered the master frame of reference bits and the hierarchy bits. About vertigo, yeah, good. It's a very nice point. You feel imprisoned in your body. You feel much more embodied. So that's correct. I have to find a way of acknowledge. So that's not inconsistent. With
No, it's not. Yeah.
Yeah. Even though it might sound like if you lose the vestibular system, then it's then you feel you shouldn't feel so embodied because I was arguing that it modulates equity.
I was thinking of this as being a distinctive bit of the phenomenology that's sort of coming from a different direction than what you're saying. That demands sort of explanation.
Yeah, definitely. So I think that's interesting because that indicates that we should look at lots of cases where you feel more embodied and see what the phenomena there is like. And the other thing that your question raises is, I think vertigo is very interesting because it's transient. There are very few cases where people permanently have vertigo. I think there are no cases they probably kill themselves if they have such cases. And what's interesting is that it's a case of transient, intense disintegration. And that's part of what's generating all these effects, because there's this instability of not having various frames of reference sort of bound together, and you're sort of stuck and can't do stuff in a way. And much of the phenomenology there is coming from the lack of integration, I think.
Yeah.
So that's a very nice point. And in terms of the semantic and the metasemantic, how does the fixing happen? Oh God, I think nobody has an answer to that. No. So Imogen Dickey wrote this big book recently, and it's interesting, but she doesn't really have an answer to any of these things. So
Default. You can make it default.
Maybe Jack could do it sometime.
yeah, Jack should do it. But I do agree that all I want to say is that it has an important role, and it's not the sole determinant. So at one point I put vestibular plus touch plus perception action loop and stuff like that. So the thought would be that in the normal functioning vestibular system will be playing an important role somehow.
Right. I mean, I think that's really important just because some readers might, on analogy with the sort of first person talking that reflexive, think there's a broad tradition of thinking that actually the way that works is there's an innate sense of self that's sort of subtracted from other, right? And I think that's not what you're saying, right? But I think it's worth sort of getting people to realize that, like, when you're talking about the proprioceptive receptive sense, you're not trying to give an account of something like an innate sense of here. You're trying to give an account of something which is playing the functional role and nailing down what here is. Because that's, I think, a pretty important difference, because you don't need to commit to the existence of something like a concept of fear like that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Good. That's very helpful. Thanks. Yeah. But even if I say that, I mean, there's one sense in which Evans doesn't have any account of how, you know, coordinating perception and action can then enter into the how the token reflective rule is fixed. Then I mean, he's got no account. I mean, we all want that.
Yeah, sure.
Somebody has to come up with something like the psychology of reference, and I think nobody has. So people have worked on the psychology of semantics a little bit, but the kind of connection between pragmatics and semantics, that's never been done.
So we've got a hand, so I'm going to move on. We've got what? You got a finger or a hand?
I don't know.
She's got her own view, so you hear it. She's got a view on her.
We've got 3 hands, so I'll take each one's been sitting here very patiently.
Yeah, okay, so this is not a criticism, but actually I like this, I have the same intuition that this might be really the basic frame of reference. And I think what's interesting, you know, with the derealization symptom, which is a symptom in several psychiatric disorders, and several psychiatric disorders do have imbalance as a symptom, right? And I think derealization is very interesting because it's kind of paradoxical or puzzling. What does it mean? So we do have experience of unreality when we are aware that what we see is unreal. So for example, a painting is given as a textbook example. You see a painting that depicts, you know, a scene, and you have a feeling that, you know, that scene is unreal. Why? Because basically you are aware that what you see is a vehicle, representational vehicle. If you move your eyeball with your finger, right, it won't seem to you that the world is moving, but what seems to you is that actually this is a representational vehicle, right? So what's interesting in derealization is that there are 2 things that are in conflict. One is that you are aware that this is reality, but it seems unreal. It seems like a vehicle rather than, right? And I think, you know, people who work on that, they think that it does have to do with, you know, with the eyeball, the motor action, automatic motor actions of the eyeball, which is connected to the vestibular system. And since this feeling of reality or unreality seems quite basic, right? And it's not about your body as well, it's about the world. And so maybe that would be a way to connect the vestibular, you know, the sense of balance, given that it basically appears to be really important in giving with the phenomenology of reality versus unreality, right? That might be a good maybe point of connection to kind of argue that it must be really basic, and maybe, you know, the most basic frame of reference, right?
Yes.
When the people say dreamy experience and misty and dreamy and so on, you know, of course there's a top-down, effect or influence, but there is also kind of bottom-up influence as well, which might well be, you know, the vestibular system.
Good. I completely agree. I think it must be more than vestibular though, because I think there are 2. So there's one explanation is that there's a disintegration of the frames of reference, and that results in some kind of they don't quite know whether it's here or there or far near and that kind of stuff. But that also must come with some kind of affect of sorts, because usually in these kinds of disorders you have some form of alien or negative affect of sorts. So it's a feeling of detachment, separation, because you have this integration in the reference frames also in vertigo, and you also have negative affect, but you don't have any feelings of unreality. So you must have a distinctive kind of affect in these kinds of situations as well. But I agree. I think the vestibular system is in some way very basic. I think it's part of the basic apparatus.
So I wanted to ask about the master frame of reference, and sort of two questions, related questions. The first is, what's the connection between your claims about the master frame of reference and your claims that the vestibular system is constitutive in some way to certain kinds of things, versus enabling. So do you see that as a condition on it being constitutive, that it is a master frame of reference? That's the sort of first question. And I guess I'm asking because I think there's a view, well, maybe there's a view that says we don't need to appeal to the idea of a master frame of reference, or at least do we? So the kind of alternative that I'm imagining is that we just think of the vestibular system as providing a very reliable source of certain kinds of information, some of which at least may be available to other sensory systems. But because it's very reliable, it may be drawn on for a wide range of tasks and tend to dominate over other possible sources in those tasks. And we might see quite a lot of the effects that you characterised as being evidence for a master frame simply as a sort of dominance effect that we see in other cases of multimodal integration of information. Now you might say, well, that's just equivalent to the idea of a master frame of reference. But I don't know whether you could say something about, what the master frame claim amounts to and how it connects to that constitutive versus enabling issue.
Good. So one way to attack what I've been pushing is, if you look at the cases of the sense of self or the sense of the world and so on, so most of the arguments I gave were arguments from modulation. So it will not distinguish between constitutive versus enabling conditions so far. So it seems that the master frame of reference is the best shot for getting at something which is constitutive, because we have a content connection here, which is very good. Then Matt is being singularly skeptical, and then you have, so his thought is that you have a master frame of reference, and then you can there are different things which pour information into it. And that would be a different way from what I push, which is that, the vestibular system is partly constitutive of this master frame of reference. So,
I think I can be more sceptical than that even, that the notion, philosophers love this idea of frames of reference. When you start pushing psychologists a little bit, what does it really amount to? What does it mean? They get a bit vague about it all. So what do we mean by saying there's a frame of reference? Well, we mean something like there's information about something that plays a role in something else. What does it mean then to say there's a frame of reference there, as opposed to just, here's a source of information, here are 5 different tasks, that information plays a role in all those tasks? Is that what it means to say there's a master frame of reference? Well, I think there's so this information, I guess we might say it encodes spatial information in a certain way. And so information encoded in that way is then playing a role in these 5 tasks. Does that mean it's a master frame of reference? Because this information might not be, say, tracking objects, or it's not a map of space, it's not...
Oh, it's a master frame in my sense, because adapting it adapts everything else in the hierarchy. So that's the sense in which it's a master frame.
But then it could just be informational dominance, I suppose, is my point. So when we're integrating 2 sources, if this is a particularly reliable source, it may just dominate. So maybe these are functionally equivalent, but I suppose my way of describing it then makes it look much less substantial than describing it as a master frame of reference makes it sound.
Well, couple things. So if you have information dominance in a large range of situations, such that it determines the character of the kind of perception and action that you get, then it starts playing a very important explanatory role. And then you want to ask whether the explanatory role is something that's what we would classify under cases of enabling, or it's more important than that. So if you buy a sharp enabling constitutive contrast, which I think nobody can really make out, then as long as I can push away the thought that it's merely modulatory, then I'm going to be fine. It's at least explanatory. And then there's a further question whether it's going to meet the golden standard of whatever constitutive is. Okay? So that would be one strategy, even if you take away talk of a master frame of reference. The second thing is that, this apparatus isn't something I invented. It's basically something from Bertels and you see sort of loose talk, because I kind of think of it of frames of reference all over the place.
It's just I'm becoming a little bit sceptical about what it really amounts to.
Yeah. So it's easier to show that it's immediately constitutive if I have the frames of reference and that figures in content, because immediately you have a content connection which is constitutive. So I can give a peacock style account very easily. But if you don't have that, then I have to rely on the other resource. And I think there I have resources to show that it's more than mere information dominance, like in the shams cases, for example. I think you're thinking of those cases as the ones where you have...
For example.
For example, yeah.
For example.
So I've got a hand I've been working on. Is this really a finger?
Yes.
A very short one. Okay.
Yes. Isn't part of your point that this frame of reference is an orientation within space, right? Not merely a location. The point about orientation is extraordinarily important for the use of any other coordinate systems other than frames of reference. So don't sell yourself short.
Yes, the other way to push it would be to say there's information dominance, but there's something special about the character of the information dominance here, such that you have something like an anchoring relation or something like that.
I mean, to push it a little bit more, you've got, so you've described all these different sensory components of the vestibular system. And I guess the idea of a master frame, somehow that's all put together into one thing, and that one thing is then used in everything else.
Yes.
But, you know, some of the things we've been talking about earlier yesterday is about how these things all come apart in various ways. So why think it all goes together in one thing, as opposed to bits of it go here, there, and everywhere, and get drawn on as and when required, and can fail in different ways and fall out in different ways and so on.
Yeah, so on that, I might want to have my cake and eat it too. So the thought would be that you don't have to have the entire global story all the time, but that you have a kind of hierarchy of frames of reference, if you allow me that talk, such that adapting the top adapts the other ones, such that loosely you maintain the hierarchy even though you have dissociations, because basically you have lots of little silly information processing systems which don't talk to each other all the time. But generally you still have the kind of dominance. And the question is, how much of the global stuff do you actually construct? And I think basically you can answer that question empirically by looking at the types of errors that people make.
I can answer myself, yeah. So I think this is more of a comment, but then there's going to be a question. So when I was reading this chapter, I was thinking a lot about Kant, and so Kant claims that kind of our representation of space is an a priori form of intuition, and he's got a couple of other works where I think he says interesting things that are on topics connected to this. So you've got this early paper about directions in space, where, well, at least, and one of the things there he's interested is left and right, and he thinks in some sense embodiment is quite central to this, maybe the feeling of touch, but rather than... And those sort of questions in Kant about why is our representation three-dimensional, and I guess if it's based upon this vestibular sense, then the fact that you've got three canals. So I've got two questions that are coming from just thinking about the relation to Kant. The first question is, from what you've said, it's not, here's a claim, a strong claim that you could make, that I'm not sure you want to make, but you might think that our representation of space depends upon the vestibular system. And you might think that even people who lose it, in some sense, the representation they've built up is due to the fact that they've had a vestibular system. So I'm wondering if there's anyone born without a vestibular system. So are there people who, not who become deafferented, but who don't have one to begin with? And I'm wondering if there are such cases. This would be an interesting question about, yeah, well, because then it would suggest that it's not necessary for the formation of this sort of representation of three-dimensional space.
If there are, it might be indirect evidence for number 3 there. But
Yeah, so that's one question. And the second question is, you're talking about orientation, and of course you've got up and down, but we've also got back and front and left and right. And you've been stressing the gravity thing, and really what you're getting is up and down. But in terms of orientation, like left and right and behind, and do you think that the vestibular system is involved in that? Or, so I think Kant's view is in some sense it's the body schema, or the left and right involves the feeling of touch maybe. So I'm wondering if you've got these different types of orientation, and we've got 3 dimensions, but then we've got up and down, left and right, back and front, and we're all orientated in all these 3 ways. And so, what's the relationship between, say, the left, right, back and front, and up and down? So how does that?
Good. So if we take the vestibular system to answer the 2 main questions, which way is up and where am I heading? So the second question already gives you the asymmetry between forward and backward. But that's partly relying on the morphological asymmetry you already have, and then it's a further question how you get to that morphological asymmetry. Maybe just from action, from bodily awareness, from many things. I think it will be a complex story how you realize that. How do you know that your mouth is in front and not at the back? Well, you try to eat from the back, it doesn't work, stuff like that.
Yeah, but I guess the movement, gives you the forward, backward.
You do a lot of sensory motor testing of the contingencies, and then you learn the contingencies and so on and so forth. So I think that's going to play a huge role. In answer to the first question, I know that they've done animal models without the vestibular sense, and they have problems in calibrating reflexes. I need to check further, but I don't know about human cases. But it seems perfectly possible that you would have such cases.
Yeah, and so it's not going to be necessary for the formation. Because you might think, well, you're getting this visual stuff, why not have a kind of, get all that information and have a 4-dimensional space?
It's not going to be necessary for the formation of space as such.
Yeah, because you've got visual space. Okay.
Can I ask a related empirical question? Stemming from deep, utter ignorance about what people used to call kinesthetic sense, which nowadays is, I take it, proprioception and vestibular reception.
No, it just depends on people. Different people use different language. So I think, for example, Matt wants to keep proprioception and kinesthesia separately. Christina also likes to do that. I was brought up in a tradition that does that, but I noticed that a lot of my scientist friends, they just use proprioception for both position sense and movement sense. So it doesn't matter, it depends on the textbook.
Okay, but that was, okay, thank you, that's helpful. But the question was about the relation between vestibular system and the proprioceptive system. What's the sort of, since they are different according to you,
they're extremely
proof or reason to believe that?
They're different.
Might want to.
One's in the ear, the other one's everywhere else.
But could you have a proprioceptive system without the vestibular system?
Yeah, in principle, yes. Because what the proprioceptive system is doing is it's transducing kind of change in angles if you have like articulatory limbs like this, and it's also tracking like stretch and stuff like that in your muscle spindles and so on and so forth. So if there was an animal which was just permanently stuck somewhere, but needed to move a little bit, but was such that its effectors was strong enough not to have to deal with computation. So you can imagine like octopuses. Octopuses aren't actually like that. They have a much more intelligent peripheral nervous system than ours, and they don't do everything centrally. So it's only quite recently that someone published in a journal that an octopus can kind of coordinate its action with vision. So I think last year was the first experimental proof of this. But what happens if you could have like an octopus-like creature stuck on the shores of the Bosphorus, and then so it's basically stuck there. So it doesn't need the vestibular sense because it's stuck, and then its action just relies on these effectors which are flailing about. They're floating in the water, and then they have chemical things such that there's fish coming, and then there's like a kind of reflex mechanism back. And then once you have that, then there's some kind of chemical thing such that you get curling response, and then it's brought to the beak of the octopus, something like that. So you wouldn't need a vestibular sense.
So maybe in human case you could have someone who lives in a complete state of zero gravity, so there is no gravity, there is no sort of material for the vestibular system, what is up and what is down, but they could still develop the proprioceptive system about or feeling of the position of their body, because I'm asking because the natural feeling.
Oh, okay. From that point of view,
the position of my body has to do
so
with
if you look at these cases, well, the problem is that proprioception depends on body shape too. So what you get from proprioceptive receptors is not like you get tendon tension and joint angles and forces. This is what you get from the receptors. You don't get the complete readout. So the receptors measure tendon tension, forces, and joint angles. Okay? This doesn't give you position. Once you have that, then you have some kind of body model which you feed the information from the receptors into, and after that you can get position sense and movement sense, because that's in external space. Now, then the question is, can you develop a thing like that without the vestibular sense? Don't know, don't think so.
Yeah, so force and tension are supposed, what is meant? They are somehow something that could take place.
Yes, you could have that,
Even
but
without
yes, but so you could get very little position sense. Things like, so for example, you could know that there's a cocking of some body part going on, but you might have no sense of how it is generally with respect to the rest of your body, because you have to develop a body model.
So I think there is a way of reading the comment which is in the metalinguistic level, which is if the metalinguistic level can get fuzzy, then we might get two here at the same time. And if I think you kind of said that, and both Evans and you kind of going against the possibility of having two here, where the here is located in two different places. And actually I think from different point of view it could make sense that it can be two here, if the here it has kind of even different functional role for one here, different functional role for another here. So at the same time I can have two here because I have different functional role for defining one here and another here. But some way it seems to be that you and Evans have to deny that possibility, but the functional role just allows that possibility.
Yeah, so this is the submarine case, if people know about this. Do people know the submarine case? So Evans discusses another of these Oxford Common Room examples. Lucas looking at me. I was never in the Oxford Common Room, by the way. I never studied at Oxford.
But you were never in an Oxford Common Room?
No.
You never slipped in and had conversations
about... But in Oxford, but never in a common room. Yeah. So I'm getting this from elsewhere.
Okay. UCL Common Room.
Yeah. Well, we don't have a real common room.
Okay.
We don't have space. So. Okay.
orientation.
The submarine case is this. So he's discussing the reference of various indexicals and whether you need self-identification and stuff like that. And then he discusses the submarine operator. And there's like he's on the ship, and then he's operating a submersible. And he's got all this kind of the scene before him with the corals and stuff like that. And then Evans asks whether the operator feels he's on the ship, or is he in the bottom of the sea. And he doesn't really settle it one way or other, but he asks questions like, if he hears a beep, does he think it's above him, namely above the ship, or above him on the ocean where the submersible is there? Okay, and that will provide a criteria for where he really is, in a sense. So this is the commitment of the functional account. And one thing that arises from the functional account is that if you're a drone pilot, or a submersible pilot, and so on and so forth, you are actually in two locations functionally speaking. Okay, but you can't actually be in two locations. And can you be so split such
not?
that...
So that is, I was questioning, because I think the functional account alone allows that you can have two here, and actually everyone's only say it cannot be, but he has no reason to hold it.
Yeah, I'm okay with saying that you're more somewhere and you're less somewhere else and so on and so forth.
Even in your account, when you have the here, then you only have one here, what you can have. So it looks like something is missing if you can have two here in different locations at the same time.
Well, okay. I want to say in the paradigm case there is one here. And then there are departures from it that are hard to explain, and in that case it might be indeterminate where you are. Because, so for example, if there's an explosion at the bottom of the sea and it's in the screen, it goes woof. And then the question is, what's the reaction of the submarine operator? Do they run from their post?
Empathetically, yes.
Or do they say, darn it, and then sip their coffee? So that would be an indication of where they are.
We're going to pick Andy. Did you have a question?
Yeah, just it's not really, well, it is a question. It's my thought goes to any relationship there might be between your general project and AI, robots, Saudi citizens, you know, like building human beings basically in that direction. Do you have any interest, comment on that?
Mm-hmm. Interesting. I started in AI actually. There are two schools of studying the mind, and so Rodney Brooks has this idea that you basically get the architecture by building it, and that way you learn about the architecture or possible architectures. And another way is by trying to get the actual architecture right. And I think the interesting thing about robotics and stuff is that it allows you to explore possible architectures, and also the idea that you can use actual architectures in order to improve possible architectures. So for example, deep learning is sort of learning from brain architectures and bringing it back to multi-layered connections.
Two ways, yeah.
So then the question is, do robots need vestibular systems? And I think it really depends on the task you want to set them. So under some...
To be human-like.
Or to be human-like, I don't know. It depends on what are whether they have to walk and stuff like that. If they
well, yes, of course.
If they're on a treadmill kind of thing, then they probably won't need a vestibular system because they can just use tactile contact as some kind of heuristic for staying up. So for example, I mean, for making them to be human, maybe it depends on what you mean making them to be human. So if you think it's like sort of mimicking human behavior, then in one sense, yes, you would need a vestibular system. But could you build a human-like humanoid which doesn't have a vestibular system? Probably, because they are peripherally deafferented subjects who don't have a vestibular system anymore.
Yeah, of course.
And so,
I guess I'm questioning more the practical of, is that a way that is being investigated to your knowledge?
No, but I do know that people have.
I guess you would advocate it.
Yeah, advocating.
Perhaps.
I don't advocate any research program in robotics in particular. I advocate all research programs. They
sure.
Let 1,000 flowers bloom.
No, it would gel nicely with your perspective. That's what I mean.
Thank you.
Okay, let's thank our two speakers. Okay. Let's not.
I'll be very quick.
Okay.
So I didn't know about the anatomy of the vestibular system until recently, and I was somewhat surprised to see that there are these three channels that are orthogonal to one another, and it's because as Lucas pointed out, there's this. It signals this possibility of our representation of space being kind of hardwired because of that anatomy. So that representation may be not universal, not necessarily in a sense, So, do you know anything about like any other species which have? Are there any other species which have similar or non-similar systems, or do you know anything like? Are there any like, I don't know, crazy experiments like surgically manipulating the vestibular system?
One of the systems that's very, very studied is the fish, because these are evolved from fish organs. That's why they have these fluid canals, and then it then closed in a certain way into the inner ear and so on. So a lot of the early vestibular physiology was done with fish, the classic experiments. And the fish vestibular system is quite different from ours. But they also need to know which way they're going and which way is up. That's very important for them. It's very hard for me to say more. So the thing is that this vestibular physiology is very disconnected from the rest of systems neuroscience and cognitive neuroscience, because vestibular physiology is so detailed that usually it's not treated in the other kinds of tech so much, because they have their own thing and they've done lots and lots and lots of very, very, very detailed psychophysical experiments. I can recommend that you read a book edited by Angelaki and colleagues, 2,000 pages, which is the Bible to the vestibular system.
Okay, so we've got our homework. Let's thank the speakers. So everyone's on their own for lunch, and it's probably best if we